Thrilled to have you here. You are all welcome to our final event of 2024, a year that has been filled with news from beginning to the very end, as we're seeing. And the Forward has been there with you, reporting from Israel, from conventions, from college campuses, working around the clock to bring you the news and analysis that you need. A year like this reminds us, not that we ever forget, how crucial it is to tell the American Jewish story fully, fairly, and to ensure that it's available to all without barriers of any kind. Which is why, as many of you know, that just a year ago this week, the Forward removed its paywall, making all of our coverage in both English
Let's try that.
and Yiddish available to everyone, everywhere, free for the first time in our 127-year history. I think we have right now, we have Nina Totenberg with us, and we have Jodi and the Forward. I have a couple more things to say, and then I am going to turn it over to the people that you're here for. So the most important thing I want to say to you is thank you. It is only because of generous donors, people just like you, many of you in this room right now, that we are able to do this work. And we are extremely grateful for the support. And we know what a privilege it is to do the work that we do. I would like you to know, if you are watching this, I would like you to know that you have had a direct impact on sustaining independent Jewish journalism. And I have to say that although last week was Giving Tuesday, it is, of course, not too late to make a gift to the Forward. So if you like what you see this evening and you feel so moved, know that your contributions will go directly to support our newsroom and bringing you the news that you want. So that is my CEO spiel. And now I'm thrilled to turn the conversation over to our guest, NPR legal correspondent Nina Totenberg, who will talk with our editor-in-chief, Jodi Rudoren, about the Supreme Court is the crown jewel of American democracy in peril. Now, I already told Nina backstage that I am a super fan. I have been listening to her for decades in every kitchen of every place I've ever lived, depending on her insightful reporting on the Supreme Court. And I will also mention that if you have not read Nina's beautiful memoir, Dinners with Ruth, about her friendship with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, let me just say it makes a great Hanukkah gift. Just saying. So Nina, as you know, we are so incredibly honored to have you join us. And now I will turn the program over to Jodi and you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And thanks to everybody in our audience, our members, and others who've supported us. We actually had originally planned this conversation for a year ago, and Nina had some back surgery, and it seems actually only more important now as we're getting together with so many critical issues at stake in front of the Supreme Court. Nina Totenberg hardly needs an introduction. Her voice is as familiar to most of us as member of our own families, but I'll just do a few quick highlights. She is about to celebrate her 50th year at National Public Radio, and she's coming to us from the newsroom in Washington of NPR. At NPR, she's known as one of the founding mothers, along with her dear friends, Linda Wertheimer, the late Cokie Roberts, and Susan Stamberg. Nina broke the story of Clarence Thomas's sexual harassment of Anita Hill, among many others, which won her a Peabody Award and a George Polk Award, and those are among her many, many awards. She grew up in New York City. Her father was a Polish-born violinist whose Stradivarius was famously stolen and then returned in a remarkable story that Nina has said is one of the most listened to and talked about of her entire oeuvre. One thing I learned about Nina just preparing for this event is that she's actually a college dropout. And as Rachel talked about 2 years ago, she published this gorgeous memoir about her close 48-year friendship with the notorious RBG, and really about friendship in general. It was on the New York Times bestseller list, and we'll be talking a lot about it in a little bit. First, just a tiny bit of housekeeping. We will be using the Q&A tab, so you can go ahead and pop your questions into the Q&A. Please don't put your questions into the chat field. I'm not even sure if you actually can chat on this webinar, but if you can, feel free to comment there, but put your questions into the Q&A, and we'll get to them toward the end of the hour. And meanwhile, we'll dive right in, with, I mean, it really is a very auspicious time to be having this conversation. You just covered the arguments on the transgender healthcare case in Tennessee, and there are so many critical issues coming before the court, and I think more like bubbling up as we ponder the second Trump administration. So I want to start with just a tiny little question. What do you think is going to happen in the trans case? What are the other key cases of this term? And what do you see as the top few issues we should be watching as Trump 2.0, kind of what issues surrounding the new Trump administration and the new agenda do you think are going to end up being decided ultimately by the Supreme Court?
Well, I think
That's going
probably
to take a couple minutes.
Yeah. So let me just say that I think probably this has been compared to recent terms so far, the court has had some very important cases, like, as you mentioned, the transgender care for minors. And there's a test of a regulation that bans ghost guns, which seems particularly important at this moment because the gun that the guy used to assassinate the head of United Healthcare, allegedly, that appears to have been a ghost gun, meaning it had no serial numbers on it, and it was an untraceable gun, which is why I suppose he felt secure taking it with him and not just tossing it somewhere. But there's a lot of, in news terms, a lot of dog cases so far. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the court reasonably thought it might have to rule on some election-related cases and wanted to leave space on the docket for that, and has continued to do that, understanding that if the second Trump administration is anything like the first Trump administration, there are going to be all kinds of big cases coming to the court very quickly, asking the court to stay the executive action that the president has taken or that is trying to take while the court, and then asking the court to review whatever the question is. So I think they're leaving themselves a lot of room. That said, they've passed up a lot of red meat cases that you might have thought this court would take, and that at least 3 members of the court, and for example, there was just a case this week about it, the elite public schools in Boston that are sort of like the Boston Latin. They're analogous to some of the Stuyvesant High School, some of the elite schools in New York they changed their acceptance criteria, and instead of making it, at some point they changed it, I think in 2021 or 2, they changed it to be more geographically diverse, so that it wasn't just a question of grades, it was a question of grades in each zip code, and the zip codes were proportional in terms of population. And so that, there are members of this court, 3 of them, I think, who made pretty clear they thought this was a violation of the Constitution's ban on requirement of equal protection of the law. Well,
this is like fundamentally an affirmative action case, right? This is following the higher ed model of Texas.
Although it's not like the affirmative action programs that the court had struck down. And this was the second time that the court declined to hear one of those cases. The first time was from Thomas Jefferson High School here in the district, which also had a zip code. And I have to say, the whole idea of doing this somewhat geographically it was something that they did in Texas. And still,
I actually covered that years ago when I was a higher ed reporter. I went to Texas, and because they accepted the top 10% of every high school in Texas to the University of Texas, Austin,
exactly,
get around the rate. This was during the time of the Michigan affirmative action cases, and they wanted to get around the race question. So it's interesting that that's happening now at the high school level.
And it didn't stay 10% because it turned out to be too many kids, but it went lower. But that's sort of the same idea. And the court just didn't do that. And there was another red meat case that had procedural problems, but still it was a gun case. And they didn't take that case, and they didn't take another gun case a few weeks ago. And I don't know whether they're leaving big space in their docket for what they know will come, or whether there are really potentially not necessarily 5 votes that you would need to, in gun cases, for example. It's not, maybe there isn't a 4th vote for that because it's not clear that there are 5 votes to prevail. It's very difficult to ascertain what's going on behind the scenes, even though we all.
But maybe it's not such a hard right court as some people
I
want
think it's pretty hard right, but it was the people used to call this the YOLO court, the you only live once court. They were grabbing everything they possibly could, every highly controversial issue they possibly could. And I think Justice Barrett, and to some extent the Chief Justice, in some of these cases may have slowed that down. Obviously, the court didn't do that in immunity, in the immunity question. That was, I think, more far-reaching than most court observers might have anticipated. But
this is the presidential immunity case, which led to the Trump prosecutions being dropped.
right, exactly right. So that's sort of where we are at the moment. And with every reason to think that there'll be a lot of big Trump cases that end up at the court. And it is a very conservative court. So it's not clear to me. It's the most conservative court probably in 90 years. And so it's not clear to me where this court is going to go. But I think it is not a court. It is a very conservative court, but not a court that wants to be a handmaiden to what are viewed as sort of corrupt corrupt decision-making that, for example, if the Justice Department were to, let's say, start prosecuting the former prosecutors, I think that would be a tough sell at this Supreme Court. Now, I think that likely for a variety of reasons may not happen, but you just don't know what is going to happen. And Mr. Trump doesn't seem to have a lot of boundaries. And so,
it sounds like the distinction is not how conservative their politics are, but really is back to the sort of integrity of the institution and the belief in the separation of powers and the idea that the court is meant, it's a lifetime. They also have to stay a long time, right? They're going to be there. There's some longer view there than maybe the.
I was just today rereading parts of Justice Jackson, not Ketanji Brown Jackson, but Justice Robert Jackson's very famous decision in which the court said to Harry Truman in the middle of the Korean War, you can't basically nationalize the steel industry because they won't do what you want them to do. That's just beyond your powers as the chief executive. And that court was made up largely of Democratic appointees. So almost all Democratic appointees. So that court was willing to say no to Harry Truman. And I suspect that this court is willing on some policy issues to say no to Donald Trump. I'm just not sure which ones they are.
Right. So 2 of the ones that seem like, one that seems possible to come very, very soon is this question of recess appointments, right? If Trump tries to go around the Senate and the traditional advise and consent process by forcing recess appointments of his unconfirmable appointees. And then, of course, the other looming huge issue is the question of deportation, right? And how those. So do you want to give us a little bit of a.
Well, there are immigration laws, but this court has been very solicitous, actually, of executive power in the immigration arena. And that includes solicitous of the power of the Biden administration when it found itself crossways with the Attorney General of Texas and the governor of Texas, who wanted to put floating things out in in the water, and the administration didn't want them to do that. They said, you're exceeding your power. And the Supreme Court basically sided with the Biden administration. And I just think that immigration is one of those areas, there are laws and there are rules, but the rules are very friendly to, by and large, to the executive agencies. And if they can, I mean, in the, what is uneuphemistically was referred to as the Muslim ban, when they, at the very beginning of the first Trump administration, when they were not letting, they were sending people back, they weren't letting them in the country, they were denying visas. The court, the administration then made a lot of mistakes in its first few tries at this, and it kept getting knocked down. It
Right.
even in its first iteration was going to deport people who had green cards. They just didn't but that is not this administration. This administration is going to be much more practiced. They've been through the not knowing what they were doing. And I think that the folks who are close to Trump know what they're going to try to do. The question is, at what point will they overreach? And at what point will the court stop them from overreaching? Because all administrations overreach. Let's get clear. This one may be more capable of that than others, but all of them overreach at some point.
So one of the other things, stepping away from the court itself for a second, one of the other things that President-elect Trump has promised is, you mentioned the potential retaliation against prosecutors, but he's of course also promised to retaliate against the media and the enemies that he sees there. And we've seen discussion already of eviscerating the public funding for NPR and PBS, as well as the idea of potentially tightening up restrictions on free speech from around the media. And I wonder how you're viewing those threats and how scared you are, and whether you think of those things, and whether you think the court will step in to sort of protect us and protect the First Amendment.
Well, there's NPR and PBS, and we're distinct from other, most other news organizations, commercial news organizations. I think probably they will go after us. And, we only get, at NPR, we only get about 1% of our funding from the federal government, from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And while it's valuable, especially when we have a particular need and they sometimes come up with extra money, the bulk of the funding really comes from our stations, which buy our programming. And while some of the big stations might be able to weather that storm, we have something like 800 stations, and a lot of them are small stations in rural America. And I don't think that they could weather that storm. They can't come up with the money. They tend to get the bulk of the money that comes from the federal government goes to the smaller stations so that they can be all over the country. And, they can report that there is a forest fire coming towards you right this minute, or cover Indian country, or cover, whatever that is not really well covered by there aren't these are newspaper deserts at this point.
Right.
In large swaths of the country. And I just have no real sense in the past, it's been very difficult to stop that funding for people opposed to public broadcasting writ large, because it's so valuable to the people who live there. And they make those views very well known. But I have no real sense at the moment how all this is going to shake out, how much of the Musk Ramaswamy show is just a show and how much is real. If you really want to cut the budget, seriously cut the budget, there are only a few ways to do it. One is entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the Defense Department, and a couple of other places like that. Those are the big chunks. That's 60 to 70% of the budget right there. Discretionary funding is really small. And we are ultimate discretionary funding. So it might be a feel-good day for some conservatives, I suppose, but it doesn't get you very far. And the question, of course, always is, how much pain does this cause you at the same time?
Great point. So in the book, there was one point in the book where you give us very simple, straightforward 3-part formula for good journalism that I loved. You said, make sure both sides of the story are represented, try to keep your personal views out of things, and learn as much about the topic as you can. Of course, over the arc of your career, trust in the media has truly plummeted. I'm not blaming you. But
Thank you.
I think it's partly because of the erosion of these principles. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and where you think we are on again, make sure both sides of the story are represented, keep your personal views out, and learn as much about the topic as you can. It feels like maybe we're not following those as rigidly as we did when you got started.
I think that's to some extent true. And it's partly provoked, I would say, by a number of things. We used to have just 3 or 4 television stations and almost no news on the radio except the hourly news and NPR. That was it. Now, there is what I call all this noise. And the noise is both from the left and the right, and there's a great deal of it. And that, I think, when you add into this sort of, I would call it for a democracy, a poisonous mix, you add in all the misinformation and disinformation on social media, and you have people all in their silos, just and I it's not that I was always perfect. I was very much not perfect, especially when I was younger. I didn't sort of know how to step back more in an investigative piece more than I would today. But I think that is, I don't want to say who is a worse offender, Fox News or MSNBC, but their bread and butter is their opinion journalism, not their journalistic journalism. It's and the more outrageous you can be, sometimes the more successful you are, as long as you don't completely put your foot in your mouth. And I mean, I can't imagine having to walk that line when you work as an opinion person for Fox News or MSNBC, because if you step wrong with your constituency, they'll have you out the door very fast. Or you go too far and you get the company in terrible trouble. Witness the Dominion voting machine stuff. You suddenly realize you have a host who is saying one thing on TV and another thing in private, and it's going to cost you millions and millions and millions of dollars. So I can't, I don't like it. I don't, I think journalism has rules. Believe me, there must be, I'm sure there are people, young people in this very building who think I'm a fuddy-duddy, but I don't, I think you should not put your personal opinions on Twitter. That's not what it's for. It would only undercut my own legitimacy if I were to say what I thought of an opinion, of a Supreme Court opinion or an argument. It doesn't serve anybody's purpose, except perhaps, I suppose, somebody would say, well, you might have a lot more followers. I have plenty of followers. I don't, that's not smart. There are just some things I don't talk about in public. It's not anybody's business but mine.
A number of times in the book, you say something like, this could never happen today. And sometimes you're talking about your own friendships with various people that you cover. Sometimes you're talking about their friendships among themselves. Sometimes you're talking about the openness with which people talk. Even security has changed. So talk a little bit about what you think we've lost over the last few years in Washington, and like how are we worse off because the place has changed, and what are the evil forces changing it?
Well, you know, we've lost respect, a lot of respect for one another and enjoyment. You know, if you have friends who don't agree with you about everything, they're also wonderful people. They're, my close friend Ted Olson died earlier this month, and it's a terrible loss for me and for hundreds and hundreds of people I know, and probably more of them are conservatives than not conservative. But on the other hand, he was also early in his life a promoter of the idea of gay rights and gay marriage, which is, he was way ahead of his times in that regard. He was way ahead of me in that regard, I think. And I once asked him, how did you come to that? And he said, I don't know. It just seemed wrong to say that you couldn't be married or you couldn't love somebody and without paying a penalty. And so I just think we all learn something and gain something from these kinds of friendships that are very much, they occur very rarely now, at least in, I would say, I don't really know what's going on in Michigan at the moment, but in this city, that kind of cross-cultural, cross-political exchange and relationship, which was very prevalent. It was the dominant ethos that, Tip O'Neill used to play golf with his opposite number, the minority leader in the House. That just does not happen now. And everybody's suspicious of everybody. And it's unpleasant. It's not nice.
Yeah. You talked about this being the most conservative court in 90 years. I wonder, though, do you think that the sort of quality of the justices in terms of both, I guess, intellect, qualifications, experience, and also ethics, is it of a different caliber than it was? We've had a number of things in the last couple of years, Clarence Thomas and the money, Judge Alito and the flags, various other ethical questions. So I wonder if you feel like there's a degrading of the role that you
Well,
see.
I think that one can be, and many people have been critical of Justice Thomas and to a lesser extent Justice Alito, but for sort of having too much social intercourse with rich, powerful Republicans, let's put it that way. But
Okay.
I think that's I suppose that's a fair criticism, unless, of course, there were people who thought I shouldn't be covering the Supreme Court because I'd been friends with Justice Ginsburg for decades. And I'd been friends with her literally for decades at the time she was named at the court. What was I supposed to do? Divorce her? I wasn't going to divorce her. She'd been my friend. She'd been my close friend for a long time. And so there is a difference between your personal friends with whom you've been friends a long time and something that sort of smacks of some sort of ethical violation. And I don't want us to think with rose-colored glasses what it was like back in the good old days before I covered the court, or even when I early covered the court, when Supreme Court justices would play poker at the White House with the president and exchange views. I am sure that I don't think that presidents actually succeeded in getting people to do anything that they didn't want to do. But, Justice Abe Fortas was finally forced off the court when he was nominated to be Chief Justice, and stuff came out about conflicts of interest. But nobody knew at the time. I later found out that, that he was advising Lyndon Johnson about bombing targets in the Vietnam War at the same time that there were war powers cases that were actually coming to the Supreme Court. So let us not think that this was some idyllic world way back when. We have way more ethics guidelines now for people who work at the White House, for lower court judges, and even now there is yes, it has holes in it. And yes, there are no enforcement mechanism, but there is now at least some ethics code that the court itself has written for itself. It may look better than it actually is, but it's better than nothing.
Thank you for that. It's good to remind us of that. I'm going to ask you something I ask like every job applicant, including interns, which is, how did you get into this racket journalism in the first place? And why did you want to cover the court? And why have you stuck with it for so long?
Well, when I think I first decided I wanted to be a reporter after I realized that I couldn't be a cop. There were no women cops in those days. So, and then I read Teddy White's, the very first one, The Making of the President, 1960. And I was, a young teenager then. And I thought, I want to do this. I don't want to be a cause person. I want to be a witness to history. I want to be able to go and run around and do all these fun things and write about it so that I want to be a high class gossip. I didn't analyze it that way, but that's essentially what even today, to some extent, I'm an explainer. In some extent, I'm a high class gossip also. And,
Very high class.
I cover the court almost exclusively now, but that wasn't always the case. Because when I first came to NPR, and I got assigned to cover the court because I'd had another job where I covered the court, but at the other job I covered millions of other things, and at NPR I covered the House and the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. I covered the Justice Department. I covered the intelligence community, and I covered every scandal that came up. And only really when we went to a million different platforms, and I would put this at 8-10 years ago at the most. I mean, we didn't have a digital presence 15 years ago.
Right.
Now I have to write digital for everything that I do. I have to do news spots we now have many more newscasts. We don't have it just on the hour. We have them on the half hour. We do podcasts. We do some social media. We do a million things to try to get people to listen to NPR and to, if you're not a listener, to read what we write in our digital space and to support us. And we may need that more than ever in the coming year or so. I hope we are a framework that has served us so well that others try to emulate us without success in general. I hope that isn't destroyed, but if it is, we're going to have to get even more people to listen to us and pay attention to us and support us.
Yeah. I mean, and we are one of the emulators of your model. I mean, when we talk about our membership model and taking down our paywall, we always talk about, the NPR model. People should invest in our journalism so that everybody can see it and hear it. And there's nothing I believe in more than that. One of the things I was you talk a lot, and other people have written a lot about the sort of old girls network that you and Linda and Koki and Susan were at NPR. But it also struck me reading the book, or actually I listened to the book. I love that you read it.
I was getting COVID as I was reading it.
Well, you sounded great. But I was thinking about how many women have covered the court for a long time. You and Linda Greenhouse and Dahlia Lithwick, and then also like Ruth Marcus and Joan. I wonder if you think there's anything to that? Is there anything about this? I mean, there's also, of course, Adam Liptak, but I don't know. Is there anything about this beat
when I started covering the court, there were only two women covering the court, me and Charlotte Moulton, who was 70 years old and covered it for UPI forever.
Careful now about the age.
And it really didn't become a beat with a lot of women in it until until much later. Linda and I, and now there are tons of us, but at the time when Linda started covering the court, there were maybe 3 or 4 of us. That's all. And now there's almost every network has a reporter who's a woman. Joan Biskupic has written wonderful books about the court and covers it for CNN. And it's, you know, but it's such a big beat when it is that almost everybody has a number two to help them, and I don't.
Well, which brings up that you have had, you said, and you had hundreds of interns. And I think,
Yes.
and you do have a little bit of help with interns. One of my college friends, I was saying to you earlier, my friend Karen Alexander was your intern the year after she graduated college. And I remember her reporting to us that while it was either an unpaid or low paid internship, you bought her a expensive coffee every afternoon, and she was eternally grateful.
It
I
was
wonder,
unpaid. It's always unpaid.
what's your secret for how to like use interns well, manage interns well? Well, it's not so easy to have young people help you out in a way that is meaningful for them and useful for your work.
Well, when Karen was my intern, I didn't necessarily only hire law students, but because the emergency docket at the court is so insane and can happen at the last minute or 11 o'clock at night, and because we do pre-writes for anything important, because we know that it could come down at any moment, and you want to be able to get it up online fast. Because of that, I actually almost, Ari Shapiro may have been one of my last non-law student interns. So I generally hire interns, I use advisedly. They get credit for working for me. They get a lot of credit so they can spend a semester with me. And in the summer, they can usually get some money from, usually most good law schools have, if you work for a nonprofit, they'll help you get paid by somebody other than me.
I'm going to ask one more question now. We're going to then turn to the Q&A, and I'll probably come back because I have more. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is throughout the book, and I think in other interviews you've done, there's sort of hints of the ways in which Jewishness, shaped your identity, and also Justice Ginsburg's. You talk about the chuppah at the wedding where she officiated at your wedding, and other instances. But I wanted to push you a little bit to speak maybe about a layer down about how or whether Jewish values, Jewish identity has shaped your work, your career. If you want to share thoughts about how it shaped her.
Well, it definitely shaped her, but it shaped her more, I think, later in life. And I'm not sure quite why, because she really was, as she often said, when her mother died and she was 17 and she wasn't allowed to be at the Minyan, that was the end for her.
Right.
She was off of this boat. That didn't mean she stopped being Jewish or feeling Jewish, but she really was not a religious person. And I think she became more so later in life. And I really never discussed it with her in any depth, which I'm sorry about, but it seemed to me a little intrusive. So I didn't say, hey, you're much more Jewish than you used to be. How come? But she was the person, it used to be at the court that the court worked on Yom Kippur. And that was not a problem for me because my mother always I either went to temple or I went to school. So I went to work, was my view. But for her, she really didn't like that, but she didn't really think that she had had the clout to do anything about it until Steve Breyer joined the court. And then there were two Jews. And she went to the Chief Justice and said, this is the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, and we shouldn't be working on that day. It's not appropriate for Steve or me or for the court. And he said, okay. And up until then, I think he was not interested in doing that. I think somebody may have said something to him before, but it didn't, they never, up until, quite recently, there was usually one Catholic, one Jew, and everybody else was a Protestant.
Right.
Now I don't know that I suppose that Justice Gorsuch is officially a Protestant. He's an Episcopalian, but he was raised Catholic. And we have, 5 other Catholics on the court. So, and 2 Jews there. So,
And what about you? Where do you see your Jewish values or Jewish background fitting into your career, your decisions?
I don't actually think it's had much to do with my career or my decisions. I definitely consider myself to have Jewish values, but that's because I'm not sure that everybody would consider what I consider to be values. I mean, I'm sure there are some of Koki's Christian values, which she felt very strongly about, which are about being a good Christian in terms of doing for others, were very important to her. And I have similar views about what I should be, how I should be behaving and what matters to me. But I don't know that except that it's in the large sense, it's part of who I am as a person. I don't think it's had much to do with my career.
So since you mentioned the heavily Catholic representation on the court, we have a question from Ava Reinfeld, who's asking, what is the future for birth control, abortion, and IVF? Another small topic for you.
Well, abortion, we now have the answer to. I was never in doubt about that answer. But I mean, I thought 5 years ago, the court was on a clear path in terms of abortion. About birth control, I don't actually know. I don't, if there were an attempt to make birth control illegal again in a state, let's say, and somebody were to bring a religious challenge to that, do I think that most of the people on this Supreme Court have probably used birth control? Yes, I do, including the Catholic members of the court. So on the other hand, if the question was, there's only one pharmacy for 100 miles and they won't fill a prescription, I wouldn't wager what the answer would be.
And do you think that, what was it, the Alabama IVF case, right? I mean, do you feel that, I think there was a moment where it felt like IVF was going to go the way of abortion, and then it seemed like that moment passed. Do you think that
There are
IVF
too
is
many
safe?
children and too many couples who've used IVF. I mean, I saw a documentary about IVF some years ago, and I was really struck by the fact that by the time some groups decided that they were opposed to IVF, it was already too late. Too many people who had been childless and so often unable to adopt for one reason or another. They were too old because there was a very strong age limit, and people didn't adopt except from Nazi Germany. Basically, there were children who were adopted who came out of Europe after World War II. But there were so many childless people who desperately wanted children and couldn't get them or have them, that the IVF was a godsend. Just too many people, and I just don't think it's going to get rolled back.
So it's sort of like same-sex marriage in the same way that the reason that sociological change happened so quickly was because everybody loves somebody who is in a same-sex relationship.
Well, I'm not sure. I think it's even more than that. I think
more mainstream.
Stronger. I think it's more mainstream than that, and that if you are an evangelical Christian in Alabama, you may still have a child that you have from IVF.
Right.
And that's why it matters. And that's why you saw Congress go, yeah, we don't want to get involved. Yeah, no, let's not do this.
But nor is it going to roll back the abortion.
No, it's
not going to change that.
No, it's not going to change that. I don't think I'll see that may change someday, but not while I'm alive, I suspect.
Two things that just have happened recently that this is kind of not really related, but still on the religion and state question. We have both the Oklahoma and Louisiana rules about Bible in classroom and 10 Commandments on the wall. those haven't been gotten to the Supreme Court yet, but they undoubtedly will. Is this court, where do you think this court will be on those issues?
Divided. And how, I don't know. How they are divided, I don't really know. But you have to remember something, and I don't, it's hard to know this, but you know, most religious Catholics of a certain age remember when they were the victims of discrimination. And the late great Walter Dellinger, who was Solicitor General in the, I guess it was the Clinton administration, but he was a great thinker and professor. And I asked him once where he got his views about church and state. And he said, because when he was a boy, when he was in school, whenever they would do the prayers or have a conversation, he was told to go stand in the hallway because he was Catholic. And he never forgot that. And there are, you know, people on this court who have a fairly clear memory of that, I think.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, and Elise Novak wants to know what news sources you rely on outside of NPR, of course. And I will amend that question to say, what are the news sources that are beyond the usual suspects that you're either relying on or checking? Because as you said, the media has fragmented and gotten very noisy.
I almost never watch television news because I don't get home in time. It's really simple. And I read when I can. I actually have delivered to the house the print editions of the Washington Post and the New York Times. And if it weren't so expensive, I'd probably get the Wall Street Journal too. But there's so many days when I have just too much to do, and the papers stack up, and at some point toward the end of the week, I go, well, okay, out into the trash, because I didn't have time that day to really read the newspaper. And I'm like everybody else. When the news is awful, whether it's, you know, what's going on in foreign countries or people being horrible to other people in this country, you know, I read the Metro section and the style section and the sports section after I read the front page. And there are days I never get beyond the front page.
Yeah. Is there a podcast or a newsletter that you subscribe to that's off the beaten path that you'd recommend? No. Okay.
No, I don't have time. I don't know where people get all this time to listen to podcasts. I listen to NPR on the radio when I'm commuting. And other than that, you know, I get home, it's dinner time. What the hell am I? Who listens to I have friends who have interesting podcasts and I don't get to listen to them. I mean, if I would listen to Strict Scrutiny, or the friend of mine named Jim Sebanius, who's been head of the negotiation section at Harvard Business School, and he's had a podcast. I can't remember what it's called. You know, when I go on vacation, I'm taking some of those to listen to because they're interesting and they're an out-of-body experience for me. What do I do negotiating? Nothing, except when we have a union contract up. I mean, you know, nothing. So, and he's interviewed all the past secretaries of state about negotiations. And so I think that'll be really interesting to listen to, but I don't have time on a regular basis to listen to podcasts.
Joel Teibloom, I thought it was Teibloom. I think we've touched this topic a little bit, but I really like the way he's asking it, so I want to ask it again. He says, as an observer, it sometimes seems that the rulings and rationales of the court are less principled and more results-oriented than previously. Do you think this is correct? And if so, what do you attribute it to?
Well, I think the court is well, I don't know quite how to say this, but the court, when I first started to cover the court, was a group of people from very diverse experiential backgrounds. So my first year covering the court, Earl Warren was Chief Justice. It was his last term. He was Chief Justice. He'd been such a popular governor of California that the Democrats didn't even run a candidate against him, I think the third time he ran. And then he ran for vice president on the ticket with Tom Dewey and did get elected. And then was named to the court by President Eisenhower. But they all had, Hugo Black had been a force in the Senate, a force, and he'd been a member of the Ku Klux Klan in order to get elected to the Senate. And Potter Stewart had been a judge, but he'd served in World War II, and he famously said, about obscenity, I know it when I see it. And I once said to him, so what is it? How do you know when he said, if it's worse than what I saw in Casablanca, it's obscenity. So, I mean,
Yeah.
these were people who, this is a court that, with the exception of Elena Kagan, is all former judges. And they all have this I think many of them have this rather either ideological, I don't call it political, I call it ideological, or academic idea of how you interpret the law, as opposed to a very kind of pragmatic view, which was the view of the Supreme Court for much of the time of the 20th and 21st centuries too. And so that makes it very different. Some of the leavening isn't there. Nino Scalia was very conservative and an originalist, but he had a wonderful sense of humor, and it was very important that he did have that sense of humor. And it's what was the basis for his friendship with Justice Ginsburg and other members of the court. So it was very normal for people to go on the court who had not been a judge. And I think that that's not a bad idea. I'm not saying that everybody on the court ought to not have been a judge, but I think not everybody in the country is a judge. I know that any president who would name somebody right out of some law practice would probably get a lot of pushback saying, well, what's his judicial experience? Well, a lot of the people who argue in front of the Supreme Court are very experienced. John Roberts did that a lot.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's not as, nobody is consistent all the time. Not the best of us and not the worst of us. And this court is a good example of that. They're not consistent all the time. So what they think is fine for a Republican president, maybe they don't think is fine for a Democratic president. Or maybe they think that standing is, we really have to be very, very vigilant about who can bring a suit. But it always seems to be when it's against their guy.
Yeah.
Or it can be the other way around. It can absolutely be the other way around.
I mean, I suppose that's what keeps it interesting for you, right? Like that people are not consistent all the time.
Yes,
That's what makes our business work.
Yes.
Okay. One more question from the audience, a different one from Lois Rubin. She said, no, you don't have time for podcasts, but she's wondering if you read fiction and who your favorite authors or what's on your nightstand right now.
So I basically read nonfiction. I love biographies, and I read a lot of nonfiction, and I read mystery stories. Some of them are very crappy, but they're sort of old-fashioned mysteries and set in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So there's not a huge amount of violence in them. So I can go to sleep listening to them. And I have a few writers mystery writers. There's a guy named Peter Granger, Grainger, who writes a series of books of procedural, but with very good characters that I love. And he writes about one a year, and I can always not wait until it comes out because they're almost always so good. And
Wonderful.
so
And what about nonfiction? You read memoir or narrative? What are you reading in nonfiction?
I read biographies. Usually not so much I read some memoirs. Like I read, the memoirs of Supreme Court justices when they write them.
That sounds like work.
It is work, but some of them are surprisingly good. I don't think the best of the lot really was Sotomayor's memoir, which is really quite beautifully written and is really very interesting up until the point when she becomes a judge. And after that, forget it. It's not interesting at all because she doesn't want to say anything. But her life is an interesting life. And Ketanji Brown Jackson's life is an interesting life. And so Yeah, so I read those, and sometimes I I love journalism memoirs. Those I do love because I live vicariously when they occur, but aren't generally very successful.
So I loved your book, and we'll end with this. It's really interesting because it's your memoir, but it's also a book about Justice Ginsburg. And at its core, as you say very clearly, and with the chapter titles, it's really a book about friendship, right? And about all the different kinds of friendships that you and she had together and with other people. And I guess, I mean, this is like asking you to say your book in a bumper sticker, but like, what's the key to a good friendship?
Showing up when you're needed. I mean, and I learned that from people. I don't think I understood that when I was really young. And Cokie and Linda really taught me that lesson. When they got me through my husband's terrible illness and then death, and then my finding happiness again. But I really learned that you really got to show up for people, even if it's just a small thing. You you have to remember that you're if you don't want to be alone, you can't let other people be alone. And that's and I've had benefited by wonderful family, wonderful sisters, and wonderful friends. And hopefully I have and will continue to be able to pay it back whenever I can.
Well, Nina, thank you very much for showing up for us. And thank you to everybody in the audience for showing up today. I am going to turn it back over to Rachel, our CEO and publisher, to close us out. But just one more thing, everybody, you will get a video of this conversation in your email, which you can share with your friends, tell them about the Forward. And just thank you again, Nina, for your incredible work over these many years. We all
Well, thank you
rely
for
on your
having me.
reporting.
It's really been fun.
And we're going to keep relying on you in the coming months as this court undoubtedly makes news. So thank you.
Yes,
My
thank you
pleasure.
so much. This was just really thrilling, just a thrilling hour, Nina. It was
Well,
so
thank you.
special. Thank you so much. And by the way, I am also a mystery reader. I wrote down that recommendation, so thanks for that. And thank you to our audience for joining us for this great, great evening. If you're inspired to support the work that we do, to support the Forward, I strongly encourage you to do so. You still have time before the end of the year to get that tax write-off. And I just want to thank you again. Thank you, audience. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Jodi. And good night, everyone.
Good night.